Dr. Chetty, welcome to Weird Sauce from Singapore and from your location, I believe, in South Africa. Could you kindly introduce yourself for our audience, please?
My name is Dr. Shankara Chetty. I'm a general practitioner in South Africa. I run a private practice in a town called Port Edward. It is a very rural, picturesque holiday destination with a large, broad clientele surrounding me. I have a background in science. I've done a Bachelor of Science degree with majors in genetics and advanced biology. And I have sub-majors in microbiology and biochemistry. I then furthered my studies doing a medical degree in JSS Medical College in India. Coming back to South Africa, I did my internship in community service in the two big hospitals in this country and found myself in a very picturesque village where I decided to open a private practice and spend my life here.
Very interesting. So you did actually leave South Africa and you went to India to study. Was that motivated by the topic specifically? Was that because you were, the subject that you wanted to study was not offered in South Africa? What led you to go back to go to India to study and then to come back?
I had completed my degree here in South Africa, my Bachelor of Science degree. I went back and did microbiology and biochemistry, seeing that those were the fields where there was more employment. My dad actually had this idea that I should become a doctor, though I didn't see myself cut out for that. Unfortunately, in South Africa at the time, it was during the time of apartheid. We had quota systems. And so I couldn't get into a medical university here. By sheer luck, my dad met a colleague of mine from school who was studying in this college in India. And that's where he got the idea that I should apply there. And so I took my chances, and within a week I was responded back to say I've been granted a place. And I think within a month I left to a new country to study medicine.
So when you said you didn't see yourself as a physician, and ahead of the conversation that we're going to have where people are going to discover all the amazing work that you've been doing, well, I don't know, prior to 2020, I'm sure you were doing this as well, but it took a different scale for the past 20 months, for what I understand. Let me just understand. So, what led you to believe that thereafter medicine was something that was suited for you? Because it's very hard as a subject matter, and it does involve people, life, death, harsh subjects.
Yes. Look, I was exposed to many doctors in my life, our family physician as well. They seem to be very strict, staunch kind of people, very hard and fast in the way they do things. There was a lot of regulation around medicine itself. And I'm a very free-spirited person. So I didn't see myself fitting into that kind of vocation. I'm also a person that's very friendly with all those around me. I had a wide circle of friends. I was always out and about. I'd like to try new things. It's just my nature. And so I just didn't see myself fitting into that very structured way of life. But my dad encouraged me and said, look, you can be any kind of doctor you'd like to. I have been very controversial throughout my medical career because I never did want to follow the rules. I've always been one to think outside the box. And that polarized the medical community that I was in, wherever I worked. And so Port Edward was a godsend. I'm left all to myself to practice my brand of medicine. And so I've enjoyed the last 18 years in this town, being able to serve my community the way I see fit. I'm friends with every one of my patients. I take an interest in their lives. I make sure that I understand their family dynamics. So none of my patients are a number. I have a vested interest in every single one of them, and I think they appreciate the effort that I put into taking care of their health.
So that leads us to these past 20 months. So I remember coming through, I think it was through Dr. Philip McMillan, who had hosted you on one of his podcasts. And I remember discovering your approach to COVID-19 and your story. And I was really stunned, having spent some time myself in South Africa, but in Cape Town at the Red Cross Hospital, working there. I thought, given the challenges of South Africa, Africa in general, very young population, very, very large population, very strained healthcare system in general, I was really taken by your experience of how you approach this disease. So for the benefit of the audience who doesn't know this long chain of event for the past 20 months for you, just tell us how you felt discovering COVID-19, both as a physician, but also as a parent, perhaps, as a your risk for yourself. How did COVID-19 arrive in South Africa?
Florence, COVID arrived here in March last year. I think vitally important is my spirituality, my understanding of nature. Throughout my career, I've always been a very spiritual person. I'm very into that kind of thing. I respect that God surrounds me. And my interest in nature has always been that that's where he does his work. And if I could understand nature, I could understand my purpose and the way he does things. So I've always had this vested interest in the seasons, in everything that's nature around me. And a beautiful town like Port Edward allowed me the latitude to live in that setting. As well, I'm a deeply faithful person when it comes to God. So I trust that there is always a bigger picture to things. As far as the science goes, I'm not one to just follow mainstream. I have a broad scientific background, and so I look at things in my own light. I've treated many patients over the years for a variety of conditions and used modalities that are completely outside the box and have had success with it. So I'm not afraid to try new things. I don't find myself bound by protocols. So when COVID hit the world scene in Wuhan, I was very interested in it. From a virology perspective, from an epidemiological perspective, I've covered it all in my studies. So I started to watch very closely the kind of information we were getting from around the globe to get a basic understanding of what I'm going to deal with when the first case arrived in my country. And before COVID came to South Africa, from the information that I'd seen around the globe, which was limited to hospital observations, I knew that we were missing something. There was something about this illness that just didn't make sense. It seemed that it had a nonlinear course. The onset was different from the usual viral infections we used to. The progression was different. Each patient seemed to have a different severity. So I knew I'm going to be dealing with something very unusual. So I'd already looked at it and tried to figure what are the possibilities that I would be dealing with when it first arrived. So when we had the first case in South Africa, it was a laugh with my staff because I think I was the only person in the country that was excited to see the first case of corona here. I had faith. I knew God has a plan, so I had no reason to fear. And I've always been of the opinion that corona is just God doing his work. We have no reason to fear it. We have reason to have trust, and we have reason to respect it. So that's what I did. I respected that I'm going to be dealing with a major illness. And if I had faith and I used the knowledge I had, I think I would be fairly well protected. So when we had the first case, my family were terrified that I chose to do this, but I was not one to walk away from a challenge. I decided to move out of my home into isolation. I spent my time seeing patients. I isolated from public. At that point in time, everyone was terrified of this virus, and I was considered to be the most dangerous person in the town, seeing coronavirus all the time. So I limited my exposure to COVID patients. I wanted to examine every single patient myself. I think the examination of a patient is vitally important in getting the clues that I needed to understand what was actually going on. I was of the opinion that patients presenting to hospital was far too late in the disease pathology to gain any meaningful understanding of what was happening. So I wanted to understand how patients started with this illness and what happened before they eventually hospitalized, were in hospital. And so I had to take the opportunity to examine every single one of them. I think I was one of the few doctors in the country that actually saw patients physically. Within the first few patients that I saw, a lot of my suspicions were confirmed that we were dealing with a virus that had a nonlinear kind of illness, that it was a two-phase illness, and a second phase that started a week after the first. What exactly happened there was, we all were aware of the dyspnea that people around the world were suffering from. And it was the reason people were put into hospital. The ventilations were an issue. No one seemed to be surviving that very well. So I was sure that there was another modality that would help. And we were definitely not treating the pathology, or we would be winning. The speed to recovery is vitally important. So whatever we do, we want to see a patient recover. We want to see improvement. So I advised every patient that came in that they must keep me informed of any worsening of symptoms. I advised my community that I would make myself available to them to allay all the fear that seemed to be circulating. And I took the time to examine all these patients whenever they came to see me and document very clearly what I was seeing. And that gave me an understanding of what actually was transpiring. The first 4 or 5 patients that presented with dyspnea, on clinical examination, I realized that this was not a pneumonia. They were acutely ill. They were not acutely ill, but very breathless. Now, I've seen many patients with pneumonia in the past, and they are usually acutely ill. These patients were not. They were tired, they were breathless, but they didn't have the typical symptoms of a pneumonia. And when you listen to their chests, their air entry was equal bilaterally with no restriction to it. It was just that they seemed to not be able to take a deep breath. There was some restriction to lung expansion that I'd noticed. The second thing that I noticed was all 4 or 5 of them presented exactly a week after the onset of symptoms. That seemed very strange, exactly a week to the day that the breathlessness started. And in some of them, the day before the onset of breathlessness, they were perfectly fine. They had thought they had recovered from the illness completely. So I realized I'm dealing with a nonlinear illness with no correlation between the two phases. And so I thought, well, the second phase was what interested me, because that's where all the mortality and the morbidity resided. And the diversity that I was seeing could not be explained by a virus. It would affect the same type of people in the very same way, and that was not happening. I was seeing elderly patients with a lot of comorbidities not having any worsening on that day, and I was seeing young patients take a turn for the worse. So that drew my attention to the fact that this was a response to the virus rather than the virus itself. We are individuals. I've never met 2 patients the same, so I think we'd all respond differently to the same situation, though the situation is usually the same. So I thought, well, if this is a response, then with my broad understanding of the pathologic basis of illness, what possibilities would exist to explain this? And the only thing that I could think about that would provide this nonlinearity would be a hypersensitivity reaction to an allergen. And it's not dependent on dose. It's not dependent on any illness, but it's dependent on your allergic propensity. I had seen from around the world that fathers and sons seem to be affected. There seemed to be a familial propensity to this illness. And with understanding that, I decided to treat accordingly. And the treatment, the speed to recovery, validated my suspicions. And from the first few patients, I've been using this modality of treatment throughout with the same success.
And so give us a scale of the amount of patients that you've seen over this period, because we're now almost 20 months into this. So give us a scale so we can understand.
In the first wave, I had gotten through, I think, close to 600 patients that I'd examined myself. Of that 600 patients, there were quite a few, more than half, that had worsening on the 8th day. I was not keen on testing everyone. It is something that is costly. So those that had clear symptoms of COVID and had clear history of contact with family members that already had COVID and tested positive, I didn't see the need to repeat test them. So when I say I went through 600 patients, those were the positive tests. There were far more that I didn't bother testing. The only patients that I documented as positives were those that worsened on the 8th day. Those that got through it without any worsening, I didn't bother to consider COVID in them. The 8th day was the focus of my work, in that my aim was to curb the suffering, the mortality and the morbidity, and that seemed to be where it all started. We got into the second wave, and in the second wave, people started to hear about my success and the work that I was doing. In the second wave of COVID, by the end of the second wave of COVID, I had covered close on to 4,000 patients. Now we're in our third wave. I think I'm closer to 7,000 patients right now. In all, I've used the very same perspective and modality to treat, that I'm dealing with a hypersensitivity trigger. And if not controlled timeously, it would lead to hyperinflammation and progress to hypercoagulability. And so the quicker I get to patients, the quicker I'll curb the mortality and morbidity that would ensue. And there's nothing that has changed. There's been a little bit of refinement here and there to my perspective. But to this very day, I use the same type of perspective to treat my patients. And in all, I haven't yet hospitalized a patient. I haven't found the need for oxygen in my practice. And I haven't had any mortality at all. I've found that with quick response and aggressive treatment, you have a patient back to relatively normal within a period of a week. And that has occurred for even some critically ill patients. Patients were terrified of being hospitalized. We knew about all the deaths. And so I was forced to see critically ill patients that should have been admitted into ICU. But for fear of death, they refused. And even with those being thrown in the deep end, I had to do ICU treatment on an outpatient basis, but I had each and every one of them recover, and recover timeously with no complications. In all the patients that I've treated, I've barely had 4 or 5 develop long COVID. The rest all recovered with no sequelae. I've not had complications. I haven't had a single person have a heart attack or stroke post-COVID. I've had 1 or 2 patients develop diabetes post-COVID, but I've not had a single long COVID case.
Wow, that's really staggering. So let me ask you another question. What was the government response to this? Because in lots of other countries around the world, it has been very difficult for some of the physicians to have even access to prescribable treatment, any type of therapy that's considered otherwise not tolerated by governments if it was out of WHO's general recommendation. So not only could they not prescribe it, but in some countries, pharmacists would not execute on the prescription. And government will basically, these doctors will get into a lot of trouble. So I'm wondering, what was the government approach? What was the state of the healthcare system in South Africa? And then we can go to what's the situation now in terms of perception of the government and action.
Well, I was well aware of the protocols. Look, I'm born outside the box when it comes to the medical fraternity. So it didn't bother me what others were saying and what others thought about their methods to manage the pandemic itself. I felt that a lot of what was being said was nonsensical. Government gravitated towards isolation and lockdowns. In all of history, we've never been able to isolate respiratory virus successfully with lockdowns and isolation measures, and I thought that nonsensical. that had started before Corona even arrived in my country. Other countries were locking down and the rest. And then I looked at the PCR testing and I thought, well, if you want to isolate this virus, it's like picking out 3 or 4 darkened grains of rice from a bowl. You need good eyesight for that, and you need speed. And the PCR test was our eyes. And it was like being partly blind, trying to find those grains of rice. And I thought, what a poor way of trying to do these public health measures. If you don't have good eyesight, you're not going to be able to isolate, track, trace. None of those things would work. So I went along with it because I have to follow the rules at some point. But I was not convinced that that was going to solve the problem. I was well aware of the controversy around the world as well. There was already some issues with hydroxychloroquine before Corona even came to South Africa. And I felt that we were having people that weren't on the front line, weren't seeing patients, making these decisions. And I knew from the start that it was going to take a GP to solve this problem, to see the patient from the start, to discuss the issues they were having and figure out where to go with this. I was the one that was going to be able to keep patients out of hospital. I also felt that denying patients early treatment was the wrong thing to do. It created a lot of fear in my community. But I was sure I was going to go against that. I'm a bit of a rebel when it comes to medicine. I don't mind doing that. I think if it benefits my patients, I don't need to ask anyone's permission to save a life or to enhance a life. So I knew from the start that there was going to be problems. So I set out to make sure that I kept under the radar. I would treat my patients, I would do my work, I would invest in understanding this illness, but I had no intention to get involved with the governance structures in the country itself. I knew that that would stifle any work that I did. So throughout the pandemic, it's been my aim to educate doctors on what I had discovered and to educate patients on how to save their own lives. And I think if I do that, no matter of governance would be able to stop me. And that's been my focus throughout.
So you had access to various repurposed drugs and molecules. You were not limited. There was no shortage of medicine that you experienced during this time. Was there?
With hydroxychloroquine, I had bought myself a stock before the pandemic hit. Immediately, when COVID got to South Africa, the controversy started up. Government pulled all the plasmaquine off the shelf, but I had stock of it, so I was forced to use it very sparingly. I didn't think that any one medication was going to be a silver bullet in this illness. So I aimed to understand where each medication fitted in and where it would be required and where not. I don't think we treat any 2 patients with the flu in the very same way. We got to understand the nuances of each individual. I also, very early on, I think by the 4th or 5th patient, when the controversy had started around hydroxychloroquine, I started looking at alternatives. And seeing that I was dealing with an allergic lung pathology, I started looking at drugs that might assist me in that. We got the traditional medications that we use for any allergic condition, your steroids, your antihistamines, and the rest. But I knew I was dealing with an unusual kind of allergy that was triggered in the lung itself. So I started looking at filarial illness because that was an illness that I knew presented in very much the same way. The dead filarial parasites triggered an allergic response in the lung, and patients became very breathless and died from that illness. And so drugs were brought onto the market to try and prevent that kind of allergic response. And one of them was ivermectin. The reason for ivermectin was that it prevented pulmonary eosinophilia or eosinophilic infiltration into the lung. So I contacted my local vet and I discussed ivermectin with him. He was surprised that I was looking at that kind of medication. I had a choice. It was ivermectin or diethyl carbamazine citrate, which was the gold standard for clearing pulmonary eosinophilia, or niclosamide. I think it's nitazoxamide overseas. So we discussed those 3. The niclosamide was available in South Africa, but because of its poor usage, There was no stock around in any pharmacies. Diethyl carbamazine citrate and ivermectin were not available in South Africa for human consumption. But the vet managed to arrange some. We managed to get a compound called milbemycin, which is made in very much the same way as ivermectin. And I decided, well, I should try it. If people were dying, I would do anything to save those lives. And I'm only trying it on those acutely ill. So it was a compassionate kind of therapeutic trial. And so he gave me 20 steak-flavored dog chews. And I kept it for those patients that got breathless as a test. And in those, I found it worked wonders. I reversed the hypoxia whenever it set in. I only used a single tablet with each patient. And they were well aware that I was doing something outside the box. But with 18 years of being with me, I think they trusted that I would do the right thing for them. And so the hydroxychloroquine and the ivermectin became more and more controversial over time. But I saw less and less need to actually use them because the benefit of the treatment that I was using was really negated the need for those kind of medications. So they got relegated to a few patients where I saw fit to use those medications. I was actually quite, I wouldn't say happy, but it was nice to have everyone distracted by those two medications, and they seemed to leave me alone to do my work quietly under the radar. So the distraction and the aversion to everyone to ivermectin played into my hands somewhat. I did mention it to friends of mine in India when I'd written my article, and it seemed to have taken off there. And now I get patients coming to me asking what's my views on ivermectin. If only they knew that I had been one of the first to use it here in the country itself. But yeah, I think we need to understand the perspective rather than look for a silver bullet here.
Right. And what's the position now with, so now it's winter in South Africa, or it's the beginning of winter. So what's the situation now in terms of the epidemic itself? And what's the situation in terms of vaccines and vaccination rollout from the government standpoint?
We are coming to the end of our winter season. We're at the start of spring now. We are in the middle of a third wave. So we're seeing, I'm averaging 40 to 50 patients a day, trying to get through this. So the winter season wasn't that severe. The virus doesn't seem to be, have any variance according to the seasonal changes that we have. We had our second wave in the midst of summer. So, there isn't that variance that we'll see in winter. As far as vaccination goes, the vaccination rollout was very slow to start with in South Africa. But over the past 3 months, it has gone on with full steam. I won't say I'm against vaccinations, but I think that we should be erring on the side of caution. And that's not happening in our country. So I'm again left with the dilemma of having to see vaccinated patients who present with this illness a little differently from those that are unvaccinated, and having to pick up the pieces again and try and figure out what vaccinations are doing to people. I've been through one unknown already, and I think the next unknown's here. I don't know what's in those vials, so I'll figure it out as we go along.
So you just said, let me confirm, you just said you're seeing patients that are, I suppose it's double vaccinees, whichever brand of vaccines South Africa has got right now. Is it the mRNA vaccines, the Pfizer, Moderna vaccines protocol?
We have two. One is the Pfizer vaccine, and we've rolled out the Johnson & Johnson vaccine to a lot of the teachers in the country. So it's just those two that I'm dealing with. I'm grateful for that. Simply because if we had a whole range of vaccines, I wouldn't figure out what's going on. So now at least I have two vaccines to compare, and two vaccines to compare against unvaccinated people.
Right. You still have the luck to have a control population.
Yes.
In some countries that's disappearing fast. So what are the things that you're noticing on breakthrough cases? of these double vaccinees? Are you seeing things that you did not see in unvaccinated patients?
Just to put some perspective to that, in the first wave, I recognized a hypersensitivity reaction being triggered on the 8th day, and I treated it as such. And the speed to recovery drew my attention to the pathophysiology being correct. And that's when I wrote my article about what I've seen. The article was written solely to educate doctors, not to be published. I didn't want to be in the public eye. In the second wave, we had the notorious South African variant. The only mutation in that variant caused a change in the amino acid base pairs of the spike protein. There was nothing else different in the virus. So I took that opportunity to understand how the change in spike protein would affect the presentation of the illness. And I saw a far more contagious virus. It spread rampantly through families. I saw more patients presenting with gastrointestinal symptoms. So I knew that this spike protein had an affinity for ACE receptors in the gut. And in the second wave, those that progressed post 8th day had a far more severe allergic reaction. And that drew my attention to the spike protein being the culprit for this allergic trigger on the 8th day. So I knew that, I had my eye on spike protein from the start, because it was the reason that a bat virus jumped species to a human population. And so I knew that coronavirus spike protein was probably the reason we're having this allergic reaction. When we put into new environments, then we'll react to things we first exposed to. And so I knew that it's likely the spike protein. The second wave confirmed that. So the biphasic nature got quickly divided into a viral phase and a hypersensitivity trigger by spike protein, which if untreated progressed into a hyperinflammatory phase, which again, if was not treated, caused hypercoagulability. And I noticed a progress with this from day 8 to day 10. If you caught the patient in that time, you'd have good outcome very quickly. After day 11, you were dealing with severe inflammation. And after day 14, we started to notice the raising D-dimers and clotting issues that started. So this was the basic understanding of how this illness progressed. So I termed the second phase of the illness, which was largely inflammatory, triggered by hypersensitivity and progressed to coagulopathy, spike protein illness, because it was the spike protein that seemed to be doing that. When I started to see vaccinated patients, I started to notice some differences. I've worked very closely with colleagues in India over the past year, and they had the Delta variant in India in their second wave. And a few of them got back to me to say, look, they're having difficulty because patients were deteriorating very early on in the illness. By the 4th or 5th day, patients were breathless and being admitted into ICU. Now, that never happened before the 8th day in unvaccinated patients and with the other variants that I was exposed to. So I thought that to be very strange. So I asked colleagues to please document the vaccine status of their patients, which was not being done, and the time of vaccination. And so it became abundantly clear that this phenomenon was related to vaccinations, not to the natural illness itself. Now that we're 3 months into vaccination here in South Africa, I can examine these patients myself and figure out exactly what is going on. There were a few unusual things that I had noticed from the start of this wave in comparison to unvaccinated patients. I've seen a lot of patients 7 to 10 days after taking the mRNA vaccine present unwell. The illness starts on about the 7 to 10 day post-vaccination, and those patients test positive for COVID. Now, that was happening too commonly for it to be coincidental. So I looked at that and I thought, well, why would this be happening? Because in that subset of patients, there were those that were isolating for almost a year since the start of this pandemic and still picked up COVID. They went to get their vaccine and went back into isolation. There were those that couldn't care less, who didn't wear a mask and traveled the country and took a vaccine. They'd never gotten COVID. And a week after the vaccination presented with COVID illness. So I found that very strange. So from looking at that presentation, I was of the opinion that this was not COVID. This was spike protein illness. The vaccine was triggering the production of spike protein. And around the 7 to 10 day, you had a sufficient production of spike protein to react if you had an allergic propensity, like unvaccinated people on the 8th day. And I had 1 or 2 patients on the 3rd or 4th day of illness deteriorate very suddenly. Now, that 3rd or 4th day is not actually the 3rd or 4th day in my understanding of the illness. It's actually +8, because you're presenting on the 8th day, not on the 1st. You basically skipped the viral phase of the illness completely and went directly to spike protein illness, which looks like COVID, because COVID is a biphasic illness. And that's usually what happens in unvaccinated patients. If you do not treat them, by the 12th or 13th day, they end up in ICU. And that's what was happening with these patients. So I started to biomark them early on. So if any patient had a history of vaccination and it was within 3 weeks of them presenting with illness, I would immediately do their usual biomarkers, their CRPs, their interleukins, and their D-dimers. And that would give me a basic understanding of who's actually having spike protein illness and who's actually having a breakthrough infection. I'm of the opinion that it takes at least a month for us to develop sufficient immunity from a vaccine. And so we cannot call any infection a breakthrough before a month has passed, because there was no immunity to break through in the first place. So I started to look at it with that perspective. And a lot of the testing that I've done, the biomarking, has proven that to be correct. These patients that present 7 to 10 days after vaccination tend to have high CRP values, raised D-dimer values, which we never see in patients, unvaccinated patients, in the first 7 days of illness. So I started treating them as spike protein illness. And I've had good recoveries in those patients. The one thing that came to light in the first wave of the illness, my understanding of this being a hypersensitivity trigger, I wanted to risk stratify patients. Now, the general consensus around the globe at the time was that patients over 55 years old were more prone to developing severe illness and death. I wasn't seeing that. I was under the impression that this was the kind of reaction you'd get if you were allergic to a bee sting. And of course, I know that a bee doesn't care whether you're diabetic or hypertensive or fat or thin. It only cares that you're allergic to it. So I was seeing that, the diversity of patients who were having reactions on the 8th day. Yes, if you had comorbidities, you'd be less likely to survive it. But even young patients were having the same kind of worsening on the 8th day. So I looked at that and I thought, well, if we could figure a better way to risk stratify, we could find those that were likely to have this reaction and we could isolate them. The rest of us would be the population that would form herd immunity. And we should not be isolated. We should be allowed to get the infection and form part of that herd immunity. So my aim was to figure out how to tell who's allergic to spike protein or who's going to have a reaction to the spike protein. And so I looked at all the different biomarkers I could investigate. The 3 most obvious were immunoglobulin E levels, tryptase levels, which gets released when you have a burst of histamine, or histamine. And all 3 proved difficult to justify. IgE is a slow marker. So it rises after a few days of allergy. And so it could not prove my hypothesis that the 8th day was crucial. The second was to look at tryptase. tryptase assays are an expensive test, and again, a slow marker. So it would not prove the 8th day and a burst of histamine release. To test histamine, you need a 24-hour urine sample, and that would require me delaying treatment for 24 hours. Knowing the progress of this illness, that didn't seem feasible. I would be dealing with critically ill patients just to get information. So I abandoned that in the first wave. I continued treating patients and I left it a hypothesis. When we got to the second wave, I started seeing long COVID cases. And I took the opportunity in those patients to do immunoglobulin E assays. And I found that every single one of them that had long COVID symptoms had raised IgE levels. And so that brought it full circle. I realized that, well, yes, we are dealing with an allergic reaction. And these patients that were having long COVID were having a mast cell activation syndrome that was not suppressed early enough. It was just a prolonged allergic response. And I treated them with the same modality and had the same kind of success. So when we started seeing vaccinated patients having these strange reactions, I started doing IgE levels on them early on. And I found that in those that presented with spike protein illness, immunoglobulin E levels were a good indicator of those who were going to have severe reactions and crash. So you are exposed to spike protein from very early on after your vaccination. It might take a while for that spike protein to become clinically significant and trigger illness. But that length of exposure allows your body to start developing IgE. And so early on, from the onset of illness, you find raised IgE levels. And depending on how raised those IgE levels are, they're a good marker as to who in that vaccinated group is going to have very severe reactions. So that allowed me a bit of risk stratification.
So that's really interesting because I think that's a conversation that we don't hear a lot about. And I think given the scale of the vaccination worldwide of these messenger RNA vaccines, specifically targeting S protein narrowly, I think those conversations need to happen because I am guessing that this is not a phenomenon that is simply focused on South Africa for some reason.
Yes, yes.
So the next question that I have, which has been lingering on during the pandemic, is the health, the metabolic health of the general population in every country is a or seems to be a significant factor, or either speed of decay or chances reduction to face the illness properly. And we are facing, I think that's not hyperbole, we are facing in the world a pandemic of poor metabolic health in most countries, not just developing countries. I mean, we see the reach of big food pretty much everywhere, and processed food, ultra-processed food. And I think even sedentarity is perhaps a second culprit in this, but the decay, the debasement of food, quality of food and nutrition is something which affects almost all population in the world. So what is the status of the general metabolic health of your patient prior to that? And have you seen something that we can be hopeful that medicine and government are going to then target lifestyle behavior as a real priority?
Look, I have, again, a very out-of-the-box kind of view when it comes to our metabolic health, our dietary supplementation, and the way we view food and the way we view eating. I think a lot of it has been taken over by big multinationals, and they are educating us in the wrong direction. I've always looked at the past. My great-grandparents were never, they never had the quality of food that we have today, but they lived long, healthy lives with no comorbidities, never developed cancer, lived to a ripe old age, without any of the supplementation, without the need for medication. So that's been something that always resided at the back of my head, that we are missing something here. And this has a huge implication for the global dietary measures that we seem to be following. So from the view of this pandemic, I found that the rural populations tended to fare a lot better. Whether that be lack of exposure to processed foods, but of course that is tempered with also a lack of access to good supplementation. So I looked at that and I thought, well, it really shows that the modern way of eating is really of no benefit to us. Just to put some perspective into that, Florence, I've always been of the opinion that there's no such thing as a healthy diet. It is a misnomer. We will never eat ourselves to health. If I look at nature around me, which has always guided the way I see my patients, and of course I've always looked at it as God's way of teaching us. It's his rules and regulations. When I look at nature around me, there is nothing that becomes healthy through eating. There's a way in which everything maintains its balance and has to be given time to self-correct. And we need to be aware of how that takes place. Now, if I had to put a little more perspective to that, food can never make you healthy. The reason I say that, if I look at life around me, life is made of cells, tissue. Be it plant, animal, bacterial, whatever it is, it's tissue, cells. And if I look at those individual cells, they can be divided into living and dead. My preoccupation is with those that are still alive. And if I had to look at those cells, there are only 3 kinds of cells in any organism. A cell, if it's alive, is either normal, like it should be. If it is not normal but alive, then it's either diseased or damaged. So I can take every cell in your body right now, and it's either normal, diseased, or damaged, if not dead. Now, the aim to health is to remove disease and damage timelessly. So I see people that have disease and damage, and they come to me to remove that disease and damage. And that would be how I improve their health. Now, to remove disease and damage, you cannot remove disease and damage by eating, simply because food is indiscriminate in what it nourishes. When you put fertilizer into your garden, even the weeds will grow. So the fertilizer does not select for normal. It grows everything. So nature has ways of selecting out disease and damage. And the only process that selects out disease and damage is starvation, deprivation. When winter comes to your garden, the diseased and damaged plants will be the first to die. They are not as resilient as the normal plants. If you starved a population of people, the ones with disease and damage would be the first to die. They are not as resilient as the others. So starvation is what leads us to good health. Unfortunately, starvation is not a very marketable commodity. Now, when I look at my grandparents, that's how they lived their lives. They ate only when they were hungry. They did not have access to food to eat 3 times a day like we do. I teach this to my patients. Starvation being the way to heal your body. All of us know that when you get unwell for any reason, you lose your appetite. And you will only get that back when the disease and damage is past. When you get your appetite back, you know you're healing. And that occurred on the 5th and 6th day with a lot of patients with COVID illness. And that's the reason I thought the virus is leaving. They got their appetites back. So I teach my patients that starvation is vitally important in your life. But it doesn't need to be taken to extremes. All you have to do is every day, get up and wait till you're hungry. No animal on this planet eats breakfast, and I think breakfast is one of the biggest mistakes we make. You get up and you get on with your day. When your body tells you that it's hungry, you can safely assume that it's done with weeding and pruning you. And so you have removed all the disease and damaged tissue that you've picked up yesterday. And then you go to eating. Our preoccupation with nutrient, I think, is nonsensical. I do a lot of gardening myself. And I know that if I buy the best quality fertilizer, but put it into my garden at the wrong time, it will do damage. But I can buy the cheapest quality and put it in at the right time, and it will work. So the timing is always more important than the quality of the fertilizer. And so I teach my patients to make sure that they're hungry before they eat. If you are not hungry, you will do damage. You will fertilize the disease and damage in your body by eating when you're not hungry. So if I look at the watch and it's 12 at the clock and it's 12 o'clock and I'm not really hungry and I choose a salad, it's good fertilizer, but it's going to damage my body because it's not the right time to be putting that fertilizer in and the quality doesn't matter. But when I'm starving, anything I eat, no matter how bad, will be healthy for me because my body would take it and absorb what it needs from that. So I teach my patients to follow nature. And unfortunately, or fortunately, this is what occurs in rural population. They don't have access to food like the middle class and upper class do. And like my grandparents, had to go to work in the morning without eating breakfast, came home that afternoon starving, were faced with poor quality food, but reveled and enjoyed it and ate to the point of complete satisfaction. And because they put in a poor quality fertilizer at the right time, they did not grow the weeds in their body. And so when they grew old, there was no cancers and no illness. So I use that perspective to treat my patients. The preoccupation with diet is a modern commercial figment of our imaginations. It has no bearing on good health. All my patients are taught to eat seasonally. A summer fruit in summer is good for you. The very same summer fruit in winter is not. God gives you everything at the right time. You must trust that. I teach my patients to eat locally grown foods. Things that are locally grown have to survive the environment you live in. Foods from other places survive those environments and are not good for you. You want to survive the town you live in. And so if we eat locally grown and seasonally, food is always in abundance. But of course, we want the sweeter stuff. We've been trained that way. And so we invest in food thinking it will make us healthy. And in the pandemic itself, I've seen that the dietary constraints that we have in our population actually can be turned on their head. It's the middle class and upper class that have been severely affected by this pandemic. The rural population are strong enough to have survived it well.
I think that's going to shock a number of people as a concept. It's turning things on its head. To conclude this conversation, which was really, really fantastic, tell me how do you think this pandemic is going to evolve? Are we assuming that we're going to live with a version of SARS-CoV-2 for many years to come, if not all times to come, in some form or another? But more importantly, how do you think the general population management in terms of healthcare is going to carry on with this? Are we going to carry on testing, for COVID every time somebody shows up? Are we going to aim for 100% vaccination everywhere, if that's even possible? Are we going to boost people 3-4 times a year? I mean, we're seeing all permutations right now between Israel, Malta, Singapore, the US, Sweden. So you're seeing a lot of options. I would like to hear what's from your crystal ball, but it's a lot better than a crystal ball because it's from pattern detection. What do you think is the likelihood of the future for us?
I think we face a very rocky road ahead. The global response to the pandemic has been totally nonsensical. This is going to leave humanity with a lot to deal with. From the perspective that I see, And from what I would have expected to happen, I would have expected that we instituted early treatment. We curbed all the mortality and morbidity with that early treatment, like I have done. And this virus would have run, like the Spanish flu, 2 or 3 waves. The third wave would be the wave that built tolerance. The fourth wave would be the wave that made it endemic. And this would have turned into a common flu. All of us would have been immune to it. And that would be the method to herd immunity. The first wave affected older patients and sensitized the younger patients. The second wave affected the younger patients. The third wave would be the wave that gave us a booster dose and brought tolerance. And that would be the end of coronavirus. Only to not end if we keep testing it. So it would have turned into a common flu. And that would have been the way God would have done it. That would have been the way nature would have intended it. But then we got vaccinations. And that's man's ego and man's hand. And we've got this global push towards mandating vaccines. So when I look at the pandemic right now, we've got a few things we're going to be dealing with. From the perspective of the illness itself, spike protein is a dangerous toxin. It triggers allergy, and that's what we've seen on the 8th day. But there's more to this than meets the eye. We've also know that it causes endothelial inflammation and myocarditis. And that's going to result in a lot of strokes and heart attacks a few months after the vaccinations. Those would be delayed responses, and especially in those who have pre-existing vessel injuries, like your diabetics and hypertensives and those with high cholesterol values. So they're at high risk. And I am afraid that these would not be documented as vaccine side effects. They would, unless we compare vaccinated and unvaccinated using all-cause mortality, we were never going to figure this out. So that's what we're going to see in the very near future. And then with the distribution of these mRNA vaccines throughout the body, we're seeing it in a lot of tissues throughout the body. mRNA is going to be manufactured in tissues where it shouldn't have been manufactured, and spike protein will be incorporated into the cell membranes of these tissues, triggering a whole host of autoimmune conditions. The diversity of those autoimmune conditions from the distribution of spike protein is mind-boggling. And that's to come in future. And so the vaccines have thrown us a curveball. We might have created a man-made pandemic for the future, a future of illness that we would not understand. So hopefully people take away their fearfulness and have more faith in God, and stop putting their faith blindly in a vaccine that has shown no benefit. It does not have a population group benefit to it, in that it does not stop infection and transmission. So mandates are ludicrous. If you can't prove a population or a group benefit, why do you care about me so much that you now wish I should not die? You don't stop me drinking, you don't stop me smoking, neither do you stop me skydiving. So the concern, I think, is unwarranted. But I think there's also a bigger game at play. I think that this is not about the vaccines. This is not about coronavirus. This is more about curbing our freedoms and our rights. And if they keep us constantly worrying about our basic needs, we won't be concerned about the freedoms we're losing. And that concerns me more, that we are losing our freedoms, and everyone out of fear seems not to care about that. At some point, we will realize that the vaccines haven't solved that problem and that we have given away our freedoms. And I think that's going to shape humanity going forward.
That's a scary prospect.
Yes, we know about it so we can respond.
Exactly. So to conclude this conversation, which I will have to listen to many times over because I think there's a lot of subtlety in what you've said, I would like to ask you, like I ask all my guests, what's your weird sauce for life? What's your recipe to get through life?
I think that we concern ourselves too much with what goes on around us. I know that I'm only in control of what I say, do, think, and feel. Everything else is beyond my control. And that's for God to decide. So I spend my life controlling what I can, what I say, do, think, and feel. And I make sure in all it's kind and useful. The rest isn't my concern. I can't change the past. I have no view of the future. But I can do what's in front of me today. So I think that we need to respect the individuality of people. We've been too quick to group people into herds, race, religion, all these kind of things, herd humanity into groups. But I've never met two patients the same. And I think God knows how to make sheep. And if he intended the humanity to be that way, he could very well have done that. But he created each one of us differently. And I think until humanity starts to realize the beauty of each individual and the uniqueness of each individual, we're not going to get the potential of each individual to see their fullest. So I think that science needs to change. Humanity needs to change in the way it looks at individuals. We shouldn't celebrate similarity. We should celebrate difference. I think that we call, in science, in medicine, we call things normal. Normal blood pressures, normal sugar values, normal blood values. But normal requires a group to be the same. And I haven't yet met two people the same. So I think that needs to be addressed. We should use the word average, the average blood pressure, the average sugar value, the average blood values. And if we stop using the word normal out of context, then there'll be no abnormal. And I think that's what's plaguing humanity, that we keep trying to classify normal. None of us ever will be. We're meant to be different. And if we celebrate that, I think we'll find a lot of different nuances that humanity has in the individuals around us, and that will grow society to no end. I'm glad to be part of a rainbow nation, but the rainbow nation requires the separation of colors. And that's something that humanity needs to get used to. That we're not the same, but we should respect each other and celebrate each other all the same.
Dr. Chetty, thank you so much for both the science and the poetry and the enlightenment. I think that's something that's of short supply at this moment. We do need science. We do need good science. We need courage, and we need also elegance in poetry and enlightenment, and to embrace our unique ability to conceive of this world with our not just our brain and a cognitive function, but also with our emotion and our empathy for one another. And I think you have incarnated this very, very powerfully for me, both in terms of what you just said, but also of your actions on the ground. Having had the courage to both do and say what is in your mind and what is in your emotion as a human being towards us all other human beings. So I want to thank you for that. And also I encourage all my listeners to go and look at the links that we will put in the show notes of this episode to find out about your work, to find out about your protocols, to read about you, and to expand their mind into science and into empathy and humanity as you show us the way. Thank you very much, Dr. Chetty. I wish you good health, and I thank you for your contribution both to this podcast and, of course, to your patient.
I thank you for the opportunity.
If this conversation stopped you in your track, share it with your network. You never know whose life you might change for the better. Thank you for listening. Stay curious about our next guest, and stay curious about life.